Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I can see there's a lot of people just signing into the live event now. So before we do formal introductions and get started, I'll just give it another minute as we wait for people to sign in. I hope that everyone's doing well this afternoon. I can see there's a couple more people joining, so we will start just shortly. Very excited to have you all here with us, both myself and Paul, who's waiting in the wings. Really excited to talk about Microsoft Fabric today. So a couple more seconds and then we'll get started. Fantastic. I think we're ready. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm very excited to be here with you today, as is Paul. So hello and welcome to our webinar, Mastering Microsoft Fabric, your guide to a successful proof of concept. I'm Fiona Lim. I'm head of strategic alliances here at Coeo. For those of you who don't know Coeo, we are a specialist Microsoft data and AI partner. We're working with organisations of all shapes and sizes across different industries to support their data initiatives. And as you can imagine, I work quite a lot with Microsoft, learning about their evolution of their data and analytics platform and what that means for our customers. And today we are here to explore Microsoft Fabric. Now, there's a lot of information readily available on the features and benefits of Fabric, but as you can imagine, that's a roadmap that's continually changing. So today we're going to focus on how we can be testing, exploring this technology with that in mind, with the changes that are coming over the next 6 months, for example, and how a proof of concept is also adaptable to these changes, especially as Fabric evolves. So I'm joined by Microsoft MVP, Paul Andrew, and co-founder of Cloud Formations, who we work very closely with, and he's our subject matter expert today. As you can see on there, we've got a nice little QR code for Paul. So if you do want to connect on LinkedIn, just pop up your phone and grab that there whilst we've got it up on screen. For our agenda today, we're going to keep it fairly light. So obviously you've already had a slight introduction from me here. We're then going to go into the main body of the webinar, which is all around delivering a successful proof of concept in your organisation, or sometimes even how you can use partners like Cloud Formations and Coeo to help you really get the most out of your proof of concept as well. Then we're going to have a Q&A session. So there is a Q&A facility available to you. So please pop your questions in the chat. I will be keeping an eye on that, ready for when we get to the Q&A section. So don't be shy there. And then we've got a little bit just in terms of next steps, and particularly you may have seen from the content from the website event agenda around Microsoft funding and how you can leverage that as part of your proof of concept or your pilot as well. So I'll give you a little bit of detail on that when we get to that stage. Amazing. So with that in mind, I'm going to actually hand over to Paul, who will give you a bigger introduction to both himself and to what it is that we are discussing here today. So I hope you enjoy the session.
Thanks, Fiona. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining me on this Thursday afternoon. And I don't know about you, but it's nice and sunny where I am, so hopefully it is where you are as well. I'm not sure if we've got anybody joining us globally, but I guess, yeah, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. It's great to have you with us today. So, yes, as Fiona has kindly said, my name is Paul Andrew. I'm one of the co-founders and CTO at Cloud Formations. I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and have been for 7 years now, I think. It's that kind of timeline of what does it feel like. The kind of point to what I do now as a consultant and in my career. So I've basically been designing and delivering Microsoft Data Platform solutions for about 15 years, I think. and I'll go through some of the content and kind of date myself by the technology that I've worked with momentarily as well. So let's get into it, shall we? Mastering Microsoft Fabric. Now there's a challenging title to start off with, but hopefully, in this mastering and in this learning and some of the points that I'm going to give you today and take away is that this will hopefully cement that reasoning for, let's get a proof of concept built. Let's make sure that we understand this latest technology from Microsoft and actually utilize it in the right way so we can drive value for our businesses. Now, to break things down, I'm going to go quite simple. I am a very simplistic person. I'm going to go for what and why, and we'll talk a little bit about the how as well and what that actually means for us. So to start off with, and it feels like it needs to be done, I'd like to just address the problem that I face quite a lot when talking to customers and otherwise of the different types of fabric. Now, I'm not talking wool or leather or cotton, of course, in the industry that we're in, the different types of fabric that we're presented with. Now, what I mean by that is the definition that Gartner has given us, what they call data fabric. I think it's important just to make that distinction firstly. And what Gartner tell us about data fabric is that, it's this data management design. It's very flexible, very reusable. There's kind of a key thing in here, though, that I like to always kind of call out when talking to people about this is that data fabric is about having both the operational data and the analytical use cases, delivered in that same deployment, in that same platform. Now, that's an interesting point and definitely a differentiator between, of course, what we're looking at today, which is Microsoft Fabric. Now, in Microsoft Fabric, as you'll see on the definition here from the Microsoft website, that is very different. And Microsoft positioned their product, of course, as very much an all-in-one analytics solution. We do not have the operational data in here. One is a concept and a pattern that we might choose to follow from Gartner. The other, of course, is a Microsoft product and a technology that we can actually use to deliver that analytics solution. So definitely a key call out, but we, as we do with all language, we shorten, we abbreviate, and we call everything fabric. But I think it is important just to distinguish there what we actually mean, because one could infer that we're going after operational data within the same platform. It could also infer that we're not using Microsoft Fabric to deliver a data fabric. Now, there you go. I've said fabric far too many times in that sentence, but hopefully the point's clear here. And hopefully it's a good starting point as well, just to set the context of what it is that we're actually looking at today. So let's move on then. Let's move on and answer that first question then. Well, what is Microsoft Fabric? Now, what I want to do is I want to take you through a few different answers to that question. Not, of course, looking at the definition on the Microsoft website, but giving you a bit more context and a bit more background. And the first answer that I'm going to give you to what is Microsoft Fabric is just with a timeline. Now, in my career, my timeline started with SQL Server 2000. I was there working at the NHS once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, maybe, working on Microsoft SQL Server 2000 in DTS packages and VB script and metadata that would dynamically rewrite those DTS packages and using the agent and scheduled tasks and all that good stuff that we had in that technology a long time ago. But as I say, dating myself by technology now. Of course, the timeline moves on. In 2010, Microsoft introduced us to their cloud platform, Azure. Everything got very cloudy or very blue. Now, things move forward, and the point here of my timeline is that the technology evolves. And what I'd like to draw your attention to firstly, using some older icons, is that we started out delivering data analytics, maybe using these tools in Azure. This is our Azure SQL Data Warehouse, as it was known. And then with the Lightning Bolt, we have Azure Data Lake Analytics, using language called USQL. Now, it was only very recently that Microsoft actually retired Azure Data Lake Analytics, and the Azure SQL Data Warehouse actually evolved into what then became Synapse. So there's some tools and evolution there. What Microsoft also gave us was a product called Azure Data Explorer. Data Explorer that allowed us to do very good queries using the Custo query language over time series data. Time series data that obviously lends itself very well to KQL. And it was great for that telemetry, those real-time events. If we had a real-time analytics scenario, then definitely a great tool that we could use. You know, the timeline moves on. Microsoft then gave us Synapse Analytics. Synapse Analytics that actually combined the Azure SQL Data Warehouse elements into what was then called a dedicated SQL pool, and the Azure Data Explorer parts that we got into a real-time analytics resource as well. So they bundled everything into Synapse Analytics. All good. We move forward again, of course, and then up to the present day, we have Microsoft Fabric. Microsoft Fabric, as it actually says in my earlier slide there on the Microsoft definition of the all-in-one analytics platform. An all-in-one analytics platform that does now combine all of the things that came before it, apart from Data Lake Analytics. The reason I'm telling you this is, and kind of the call out here, is that if you do a bit of a Google or a search for the release dates of these things, you see this 2-year gap, approximately. A 2-year gap between the release of these products and that evolution of the tooling that Microsoft has taken us on, and how this tooling has now come to be as the unified platform in Fabric of all of the things that we want. So this is good, but what I would then probably say cynically is that is 2 years now the benchmark for this tooling to live and die by before the next thing comes along? You know, what happens in the next 2 years? Now, Fabric in May of 2023 went into public preview, and then it went generally available a bit later. What's going to happen in the next 2 years from that point? Who knows? Of course, if you ask Microsoft, then of course Fabric is here to stay forever. But you know, we know that technology evolves. Technology evolves at a massive, a really fast pace. And that breadth and that depth of knowledge that we have to use that technology is ever increasing. And honestly, I feel it too every day. Now, the takeaway here, and what I'd like to do is, you know, throughout this, we're focusing on that POC, is kind of give you some takeaways, some snippets and points that we would like to kind of focus on and inform what we then might do next. And what I'd say to you here is just be mindful of the technology that came before Microsoft Fabric. Now, what I mean by that as well is that don't just focus on fitting the new and shiny thing to the problem. Let's find the right tool for the requirements that we actually have, because there's an evolution. And certain people might say, oh, yeah, what is your problem? The answer's Fabric. Of course, the answer's Fabric. But as a consultant, the better answer is, well, it depends. It depends. So this is kind of the first answer I'll give you. What is Microsoft Fabric? Well, let's think about what it is in terms of the timeline, in terms of that tooling and that evolution. To continue that, and yeah, kind of to come back to what I said earlier, that end-to-end analytics solution. We're no longer stitching together analytics services from multiple vendors. Fine. Okay, Microsoft, you know, I accept and I understand that. And honestly, I actually share the vision of that, the vision of what Microsoft Fabric gives us in terms of that unified platform, because it's great. Because I think back to my days of working with SQL Server, probably not 2000, but you know, certainly 2005 onwards, probably 2012, 2014, I used very heavily. Because in Microsoft SQL Server, it was a unified product of all those data processing tools that I needed. It had integration services and analysis services, reporting services, and of course the database engine as well. So Microsoft SQL Server on premises at the time was that unified platform for data integration. You could have a database in there, in the database engine of SQL Server, dealing with the operational data and the analytics data. Could we say that Microsoft SQL Server was a data fabric solution? Maybe we could make that argument, but tools and concepts and evolution here is the thing to be cognizant of. If we change the picture slightly and we look at that tooling stack, we look at where we came from, a similar timeline, but with a sort of different perspective here of we have our storage, we have our orchestration, we have our compute, and we have some mechanism perhaps to consume that data. This is how that stack is evolving. Now, if you'd said to me 2-3 years ago, perhaps, what are the tools that we need to deliver that analytics solution, then I might have gone with those core resources of Data Factory, Databricks, Data Lake. Everything beginning with data, bricks, factory, lake. That was all good. We evolved to Synapse. Now we've evolved again to Fabric. So again, I'm just kind of answering that same question here of, well, what is Microsoft Fabric? Here's what it looks like in the context of the tools that came before it. Delivering perhaps those same capabilities and those same problems, that problem of delivering insight for our business using the data that we have to drive that value, to stay ahead of the competition. The problem hasn't changed, the tooling has just evolved. Let's go a little deeper. Let's look inside that box of Microsoft Fabric at the resources that it now gives us. What Microsoft calls experiences, the experiences that you get within the Microsoft Fabric product. We see things here beginning with data. I like that. Integration, engineering, warehousing, science. We have real-time analytics. We have business intelligence. Data Activator is a great and interesting capability. And of course, One Lake, that's the stories that underpins all of it. Now, if we think about those experiences and what those experiences give us, we can do things with our integrations to handle our workloads, to orchestrate and deliver dependency chains and scheduling of what we might want to execute. We've got our full code engineering in Python and Scala and R and SQL if we want. Data warehousing like we've had before, now with T-SQL support, doing that predictable work with experimentation. Our Data Explorer capabilities in there now with KQL. Power BI, of course, featuring heavily to deliver those dashboards and that business intelligence with DAX and support for M or Power Query. The Data Activator capability is the net new and the kind of the interesting one for me, where we can now actually trigger events based on those outputs, based on a stream, based on the metrics of a dashboard that we can apply tolerances to do things with. And as I've said, the One Lake sitting there as that distributed storage for everything that comes above it. That distributed storage formatted using the open standard of Delta Lake tables. All good. Now, to apply that evolution lens to this, we could say, well, data integration, think Data Factory. Data engineering, think Azure Databricks maybe, and Apache Spark. All of these things that existed before, we're just evolving the tooling. So my answer here of, well, what is Microsoft Fabric? It's lots of things. It's that complete suite of products, but it's all the things that we then might need to use to deliver our next analytics platform. Now, the second point I'd like to make for you is, if we think about all of that tooling, be careful. Don't try and use everything. I said, firstly, in my first point about fitting the right tools to the problem, same idea here, but if we look at everything that Microsoft Fabric gives us, let's just be careful. Pick a targeted subset of those resources to deliver our use cases. Let's not try and use everything just for the sake of it. And I have seen people do that, by the way, which is why I'm kind of calling it out. It might be obvious, but then we just end up using tools that aren't naturally supposed to be used for whatever we're doing. If you've got a real-time analytics use case, go for that. We don't have to do all the other stuff as well. Good. Now, let me change the question. I've talked about what is Microsoft Fabric. Let's change the question to why Microsoft Fabric. Why should we use it? Why should we care? The so what argument, if you like. Now, the way I'd answer that for you today is, again, a few different ways. My first answer would be, well, if we think about all those experiences and how they're organized and yet what we actually do practically in terms of using them, we have workspaces. Workspaces that we can now access if we go to fabric.microsoft.com. This is the new URL for your favorites. Fine. But if we think about what came before it, what I would call before Fabric, and what we might argue and might say is that before Fabric, we didn't use workspaces, or we certainly didn't use workspaces in Azure. As a Azure data engineer, I would go to portal.azure.com. And then my business users might go to powerbi.com. I'm playing on the URLs a little bit here, but hopefully my Venn diagram kind of makes this real, that before Fabric, these two groups of engineers and business users were very separated. They came together when it came to dashboards and delivering those insights in Power BI, let's say. You know, the engineers would prepare everything in the Azure portal, and then they would pass it over to the business users or the analysts to actually get the value from it. So there's very much a separation of URLs, if you like. Now, after Fabric, we could say that, if I torture my Venn diagram slightly here, but as you can appreciate, that after Fabric, we're all going to the same URL. We're all going to the same place. Now, for me, that's great because it means that those business users are now empowered to use all of those other tools that previously only existed in Azure, but they've now got access to them through Fabric, through that evolution of the tooling, which is great because it means that then they can do all the other stuff as well. They're not just serving on a semantic layer to create a dashboard. They could go and do some of their own exploration if they wanted to. Now, this could be a good thing, this could be a bad thing. My stance today is that this is a good thing. Those business users are empowered, and it means that they can explore and they can do things. But what I'd say is, and it's my third point, is it's okay. Sure, let's empower those business users, but it needs careful governance. Careful governance that should then be included along with culture and adoption, so we can socialize those capabilities of Fabric carefully. Now, what I've said here in my point is, and I hope this resonates, but we don't want to end up with Excel hell again. Many different versions of the truth, and lots of people doing all different things to manipulate pivot tables, maybe in ways that they want to present their version of the truth. We want to avoid that. So yes, it's good that these business users are empowered. They've got the tools, they've got everything. We're all together in the same place here, the same technology. Let's just be careful. Let's make sure that that's managed properly. You know, if we think about wider architectures and things, we're not just going after the technology as the problem now, it's the people and the process as well. We need to bring everybody together here. So culture and adoption, socializing, empowering the business users, but with careful governance is my kind of takeaway here. So why Fabric? Empowering the business users. Great. Let's take another perspective on this then. Why else might we want to use Microsoft Fabric? Well, the other answer that I'll give you is if we consider an alternative data platform, not using Microsoft Fabric, what we've been doing for many years, we have our data sources, we have our data insight, we want to get there. And we might go through some processes and patterns of landing that data in raw and cleaning it, enriching it, modeling it, etc., etc., etc. Many steps that we might go through to get that insight. Now, as the technology has evolved, we've done things to shortcut that, you know, to create frameworks and accelerators, integrating things and exposing them, embedding them, using capabilities like AutoML to try and get those answers quickly, understand what we're doing. Having things like data ops and more abstraction and serverless, all in that pursuit of getting that insight. And that's fine. This is not a bad thing. You know, like all things, we evolve. The tooling and the platform and our environments here evolve. And we bake in a lot of technical goodness in order to get to that insight. But we often end up with a lot of common problems. We might end up with lack of ownership and lack of quality, lack of governance, maybe some bottlenecks in centralized teams and things here. Now, this is just what naturally occurs. Some of it is expected, some unexpected, but this is what happens. Now, we think about, well, why Fabric here? Now, the first thing I'd say to you is that considering this perhaps monolith platform, it's very generic. There's no technology or tooling here. There's just that pursuit of insight. If we look at that and we think, well, okay, firstly, let's say that such a platform should not be the scope of a POC. We're not going to go after everything in here. But what we could, of course, do is perhaps use a thin slice of this to then inform what a POC might include as its scope. And that's good, because then it means that we can actually have a production workload alongside it that we could use to reconcile the outcome of our POC. Some of that user acceptance testing becomes baked in because we're building to something that already existed. And this is good. We don't focus so much on the data and the outputs because we already have it. We just focus on the tooling. So we could do that. So this is another kind of side argument here. Well, let's think about that and why Fabric. The better argument, of course, and the reason for drawing such a crazy picture is that I want us to think about, well, what might that source to insight look like if we were to build it in Fabric? Would we have all of these same steps and do all of this same stuff? The answer is probably no. In Fabric, we might create a much simpler picture. A simpler picture that looks maybe like this. Here we have our data sources on the left, and we expose that insight on the right. Now, we're not going through as many phases here, but this is what Microsoft in the beginning called a happy path, or a architecture pattern to delivering a solution in Fabric, using those experiences. Now, this is certainly much simpler than my previous picture, but also if I look at this with a technical lens, there's some great innovation that's kind of been baked in here that's not particularly obvious, which I want to call out for you. The first part is this ability to create shortcuts to our existing storage or our even other OneLakes. We create those shortcuts and then we can actually expose everything that's in that existing storage to our Fabric compute. This is great. It means that we could use an existing lakehouse that's been created elsewhere, create a shortcut to Fabric. It'll understand all of the Delta Lake tables that are already in there and expose them. So it's a really great way to quickly get into Fabric with our existing warehouse, perhaps, our existing storage, without needing to do any copying and moving around of the data. And stay there, we'll just create a shortcut to it. Great. Another thing that's happening on the right-hand side of this picture is that when Power BI is consuming data from the lakehouse, it also has this ability that Microsoft called Direct Lake, where instead of going through lots of different layers, Power BI is now able to connect directly to the Delta Lake tables. The Vertipack engine that was kind of baked into analysis services once upon a time, it can now directly read the Parquet files that exist in that storage, which means that we've got an alternative way now for our users to serve on that data much quicker than they had before. Now, Direct Lake is not a replacement to a full semantic model that you might want to build. And if you've got complex measures and KPIs and things, then maybe there's still a path of where you might need to import that data for speed and caching, sure. But there's an alternative here. Those empowered business users, they can directly serve on the data that is in our OneLake. We don't have to transform it. We probably want to, but we don't have to. They can get those insights quickly, understand the value in that data before they do anything. Now, in the context of our POC, having a quick shortcut and quickly serving on that data is great. Yeah, we can get there much quicker. So that question of, well, why Fabric? It means that we can rapidly deliver something, and it's much simpler than perhaps the monolith solution we had before it. There's one other technical capability that I want to call out here. Now, it doesn't naturally fit with the pictures, but I wanted to call it out anyway. And that's another technical capability that Microsoft called database mirroring. They announced this in public preview at the Fabric conference in Las Vegas a few weeks ago. It's the ability now to make that ingestion story much easier for databases like SQL Server or SQL DBs in Azure. Mirroring means that we can take a change feed from the transactional database, if that's what it is, or the operational database, and that data using those change feed transaction logs can be written to OneLake directly. It means that ingestion story then becomes so much quicker, so much easier. So other parts of this product that give us that innovation that we might want to consider. Why Fabric? Because we can expose our data much quicker, much easier, much simpler. Now, this is one pattern and obviously a few technical areas that I'm calling out for you that we might want to utilize. This is not the only pattern. This is what Microsoft call their Lakehouse pattern. We also have a version of this if we're considering data warehousing. We see similar things in here in terms of shortcuts and mounting, getting that data to where it needs to be. We have a data science flavor, a pattern, a guide that we could use, and maybe a real-time analytics flavor of it as well. Let's think about, which pattern is going to be right for us as a way to actually get there and expose our data quickly. Now, as a takeaway in the context of perhaps a POC we might build, my advice to you would be maybe target one or two of these patterns. Let's try and maximize on those innovations that I showed you with mirroring, with mounting things, maybe using Direct Lake to quickly serve on that data. What I'd say is that for our POC solution, let's try and avoid just creating more ETL, more copying of data or moving of data around, because that takes a lot of effort and can be expensive in terms of time and compute. Let's try and leave the data where it is and use those innovations in Fabric to get there quickly. Excuse me, that's my 5th point for you today. So why Fabric? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons there. Now with that, let's kind of change gears a little bit. I've said to you what and why Fabric, and I've made lots of arguments and things along the way, lots of points that we might want to consider for a proof of concept as well. Let's now think about what I'm going to call the technology maturity versus your project delivery. Important points, hopefully. The first arguments that I'm going to make for you here is what I like to think about when I think about this evolution of the products. An evolution that I've obviously mentioned lots of times now, not just with Fabric, but with many things. Now, what I could very crudely do is draw us a chart here. A chart where on my y-axis, I've got what I'm calling delivery friction. On the x-axis, the product maturity. Now, because I'm very cynical, I've been doing this in my career a long time, I look at the evolution of these products and the things that we have. And maybe as a guess, using my experience as a gut feel here, I might put an Azure icon somewhere here. Quite mature. Probably very mature in some cases. I'm not going after every single Azure resource, I appreciate. But as a whole platform, we could say yes. Azure has been with us since 2010 now. Some of the data resources within it, like Data Factory, have been with us since 2016. So there's a lot of maturity there. And because of that maturity, it means that my delivery friction is quite low. It's quite easy to do everything that I need to do. I might put Power BI on this chart somewhere, maybe around that point. Pretty mature, still some friction around CI/CD and things like that. Still some workarounds we need there, but overall not bad. Now, as you could probably imagine, Microsoft Fabric is our focus today. Now, I'd put Microsoft Fabric somewhere here. It's less than a year old still. It's not mature. But there's lots of good innovations in there, but it's not mature. And because of that, it means that my delivery friction in terms of what I want to go and build could be quite high. Probably not for a POC, but there are some other concerns in here. And let me just kind of call those out as I see them today. There's a timeline here to be very clear. Today we have limited API support, which means that if I want to do things with metadata and automated processes and bring my product accelerators to the party, then I might struggle because that API support, those SDKs aren't there yet. Network connectivity is certainly a challenge for customers that want or have a very large corporate network. Private network connectivity is that extra layer of security that they have to have. Microsoft, I think only a few weeks ago, announced private endpoints for storage in Fabric. It's okay, it's coming, there's a timeline, it's just not there yet. We have an incomplete security model. And what that means for me is that, sure, in terms of the resources and the governance and the workspaces, there's security there, but it's not complete yet. It doesn't have all the features and the things that I might want to do to control access to certain data sets and do things and have all of that respected by all of the resources that exist in Fabric. It's coming. We know that Microsoft have told us about one security and it's coming, but there's friction here. A couple of others along here, the source control and DevOps, still a bit of a pain point, but it's okay. We're going after a POC. So we're going to assume that we have a single environment there. So that's okay. We won't worry about that yet. But when we go into production, this could become a factor. Limited data integration triggering is kind of a key one. If I think about the feature parity that we have with the Fabric integration pipelines versus Azure Data Factory. Data Factory can trigger things using custom events and tumbling windows and lots of other ways. In Fabric at the moment, we only have a recurring schedule. So differences, friction, concerns maybe. Abstract compute and limited features for controlling that compute, which we're going to go a little deeper into in a moment. Now, what I'd say is here, check out the Microsoft website. They publicly make available all of these things and what they're doing and when they expect them to land by quarter. So aka.ms/Fabric roadmap. Go check that out. It will obviously help you make an informed decision about what features that are in there, what you might need. Now, I said, let's go a little deeper onto that compute argument for a moment, because I think there's kind of some interesting stuff as well, just to kind of share with you and talk about. Now, if we think about compute in Fabric, what we know is that we now have this concept of a capacity, similar to what we've had in Power BI for a long time now. But we define a Fabric capacity as that shared compute that is used by all of our workspaces. As we choose, we can control this. An F64 capacity, similar to what we had in Power BI as a P1, gives us 8 CPU cores, or virtual CPU cores are the equivalent. That's fine. But with that capacity, we need to pay for it. We need to pay for it monthly. And if we think about that and think about where we've been with Microsoft Azure, we've had a pay-as-you-go model with our run costs for a long time in Azure. We said to our finance guys, don't worry about capital investment in SQL Server and hardware and all of that stuff, because we're moving to an operating cost model. We have pay-as-you-go resources in Azure, and that was good, that was fine. Hard to predict, but it was fine. It feels like for me we're going a little bit back the other way. We now have to justify a capital investment of a Fabric capacity of some size. Now, once upon a time, my customers would say in Azure, well, what does it cost? I can answer that question now with a Fabric capacity. This is what it costs. But the better question is, well, am I going to use all of it? Do I need all of that compute? What size capacity do I actually want? These are the challenging questions now, not so much the cost, but OpEx versus CapEx. Feels like we're a little bit of both with Fabric. The other thing to call out here when we're looking at that compute is what I'd like to introduce you to, or what you might even know about. It's called bursting and smoothing. Now, if we were to look at my hypothetical workload over time of how much compute am I using to deliver my data platform. I have peaks and troughs in here. It's a roller coaster. Now, what might happen is that if I've got that F64 capacity, could we say that, oh no, I'm not going to have enough resources to deliver whatever I need for my business users? That's not the case with Fabric, because what Microsoft actually do, very helpfully, is that they say to us, we will smooth out where you've gone over your capacity. We'll allow you to use more than that you actually pay for, and that's okay. We'll smooth it out and then we'll just kind of apply it to where you're not using it. So we smooth out the peaks and troughs just into my usage of that capacity. And this is great because it means that my processes can run faster. I'm still paying the same amount, but it's bursting and smoothing. It's great in terms of usage. It's hard to understand and predict in terms of that capacity and what size we need and what's going to come. There's lots of great reports that Microsoft make available in terms of capacity utilization, but it obviously just takes a little bit more digging to get into, I'm doing this amount of data analytics, what amount of compute do I need? Do I go under to assume that I can burst above it and then it'll smooth out, or is something else that needs to happen? So challenging. Now, what I'd probably summarize by saying to you is my sixth point here is, with all of these things, there's a timeline. Microsoft Fabric will mature. The team are working really hard. I've spoken to them quite regularly. There's so many updates coming, like a fire hose of updates almost. So I'd say follow the Microsoft product team updates very closely. There's concerns about that delivery friction. Absolutely. Is it going to impact on our POC? I don't think so. We can still create one. But what we should do is we should then be mindful of that timeline. If we're going to go into production and where some of these concerns might be an issue for us on that solution. So this is kind of my sixth argument. Consider the delivery friction, the maturity. Now, there's another perspective or another stance we could take, again, just to inform you on what we might want to do here if we're starting out with a POC or even a bigger project. If I said to you, let's think about an indicative timeline and that delivery impact versus that product immaturity. We might say, okay, I'm going to take the hit. I'm going to build everything in Microsoft Fabric today, but I appreciate that that's going to come with some delivery friction. Okay. We might say, I don't want to do that. I'm going to use the mature technologies, no friction. It means that I can get there quicker. An indicative timeline. What I'd say is there's perhaps a better option, certainly for our POC as well, a better option of maybe a hybrid approach, something that means that we can actually use Azure to maybe do our data ingest and maybe do something in Fabric to serve our data, to empower those business users. I don't want to create more Venn diagrams and more separation of what people are empowered to do, but we could. If we drill into that and think about those patterns, what I'm saying here is that if we go after the terminology of a bronze, silver, gold set of layers in our processes, maybe we deliver bronze and silver in Azure. Maybe we use Fabric to deliver that gold layer, do that data curation and serving and modeling. We could. Food for thought. Certainly we could create a POC just on the gold layer now in Fabric, using whatever we've already got cleansed in our silver layers that come before it in Azure, using that shortcut capability. We could do that very quickly and very easily. So things to think about there, that technology maturity versus project delivery. Now with my indicative timelines, we could also maybe go after a second phase migration, perhaps. We've taken a break, we've done our POC, we take a pause, we wait for Microsoft Fabric to mature, which it will, and then once it has, we look at our Azure portion of the platform that's maybe doing the ingest or something else, and we evolve it into a full Fabric solution. Now, this means that we can obviously quickly and easily, and more importantly, plan for doing that. In our POC, we planned for this evolution, which means we can then upgrade everything that we might already have in Azure into Fabric. It's what we could do. It works well. I've seen it happen. So my 7th point for you here is, well, let's consider that. Planning for that hybrid approach. It can offer many advantages, and it will allow for that easier evolution into a full Fabric solution later. Importantly, if you're using those open standards like Delta Lake. Delta Lake in Azure, very easy to apply the same in Fabric later. So if we stick with the open standards, we can evolve. So hopefully I've given you some good things to think about there, and conscious of time, so I'm now going to just wrap up with some conclusions, and then we can do Q&A. And other things to kind of think about here, some other nuggets of information. The first thing I want to call out, which you might already be aware of, is that Microsoft really have gone to town with the learning experiences with Fabric. They've got a new exam, the DP600. I'm sure you've probably seen it on social media and things. Lots of people taking it and going through that. I'd definitely recommend it. Do as I say, not do as I do. I have not taken it myself yet when I have some spare time, but it is a great set of learning content and material to get there. It will really help your teams inform what they do with Fabric. So go and check that out. The other thing I just want to call out here is that for that POC, get a trial capacity of Fabric. It's not going to cost you anything today. Now, the number one question I get asked is, well, once I've started that trial capacity, you'll probably see this in your portal. Fabric capacity in the trial, you have 59 days left to use it. The question I get asked is, well, my 59 days, it's not counting down. When's it going to start counting down? I don't know, but I've had the trial capacity in Fabric now for many months, and Microsoft have not yet started that clock ticking. So it means that it's still free. That's great. Now, what I would say is Microsoft obviously love to announce things at big conferences. We had the Fabric conference over in Las Vegas. There's another big conference coming in Seattle, Microsoft Build soon. Maybe there's some more announcements coming there. Maybe they might start that clock ticking. I don't know. I'm completely guessing. But let's just be mindful of this in the context of our POC. We can use free compute now. We can try it out. But at some point, we are going to have to speak to the finance people and ask them to pay for that capacity. Microsoft will also, for information, want you to target an F64 because as I understand it, an F64 will then give you those Copilot capabilities as well. Things to think about there with that compute, but nothing stopping us today, certainly. So my kind of key takeaways, or my first takeaway, let's definitely together or on your own go and create that POC to deliver that business value, and I think ultimately upskill your teams on that latest technology. Let innovation flow, let them use the technologies and basically have a play around with Fabric and do something, create some business value as well. And then if we've got a much longer strategic timeline, let's maybe evolve that solution into a production Fabric environment as well. And then, of course, the things that I've called out as I've gone through those slides, more highlighting as well. Be mindful of that technology. Don't try and use everything. Careful governance. Maybe use that thin slice to inform what you do. Target a couple of those patterns to help with the innovation. Definitely follow the Microsoft product team updates because, there's more coming, more great stuff coming. And definitely allow for that easier evolution to Fabric as we go. And with that, folks, I'll say thank you very much for listening to me, and we can now move over to Q&A.
Amazing, thank you, Paul. There's definitely a few things that you've pulled out there that I didn't know, so that's really great insight. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
We've got one question that's come through on the chat relating to shortcuts. So the question is, can shortcuts be pointed at an on-prem data source? So would the ingestion strategy be to CDC the tables to Fabric and then create staging tables on Fabric?
Yeah,
Or what's
great
your
question.
recommendation?
I'm a consultant. I've got to say it depends, right? It's a moving feast. So there are limitations at the moment. Microsoft only very recently announced the ability to have what they're calling an on-premises data gateway. So similar to the technologies that we had before in Azure Data Factory, where we had a self-hosted integration runtime, that could be that client on that remote network or on premises that allow us to bring our data in. There's some kind of movements and things happening there. What we have in Fabric is not, we do not have feature parity yet with that scenario, but there's things coming. We've got that on-premises gateway to copy the data, but shortcuts is not a feature that as I understand, is available yet. But yeah, I think it would be a great capability. It's challenging though, because of course on-premises, if we're creating a shortcut, that concept of a shortcut means the data isn't really moving. But you know, if it's on premises, then perhaps the implication would be that we have to move it, we have to copy it. So is it really a shortcut at that point, or are we actually just doing a normal ingestion routine? Of course, with cloud resources, it's a bit easier because, you know, the things are physically together, shall we say. But yeah, great question. Not the best answer, but I say it depends, but hopefully you get what it depends on.
Fab, thank you. There's one question that I've got, so we haven't got anything else that's come. Oh, actually, I've got a couple more through the chat. Bear with me. Can we enable or disable some of the Fabric features and limit these to a smaller group so that we have strict controls around what tools we want to expose to our data customers internally? Yeah,
another great question. It's where we've got gaps in that security model, I guess, still at the moment. The short answer is no. You know, once you've turned on Fabric and a user's got access to a workspace, then sure, you know, they can create real-time analytics and dashboards and everything. It'll be great to, yeah, as you say, limit them to a subset of the experiences that are in there, but not yet. Is the simple answer, I'm afraid.
Okay, lovely. And there's a couple, just to extend actually what you were just saying in regards to the shortcuts to on-prem. So one particularly around reservation costs and what's the minimum reservation time. And then secondary to that, would an external ADF be needed to use and move the data from on-prem? So it's almost two parts to that there.
Yeah, I'm not entirely following what we mean by reservation there. I guess it would, yeah, depending on the, I'm just kind of thinking what else we might mean there, but there's going to be certain scenarios if we've got things like a third-party database where we might need an ODBC driver or something a little more exotic to actually copy that data in, then sure, today we might still need to use Data Factory for that. You know, that evolution of that on-premises data gateway in Fabric, it's, you know, it's coming, but yeah, I think to be figured out.
Perfect. We've got one more. We've got time for one more question, if that's okay. For an organisation, how do we decide if we should go with Azure Databricks or Fabric as a data platform? Both seem to provide the same capability. It's a good question.
Yeah, really great question. I joked around this question a lot when I was asked the same thing of, do I go with Azure Databricks or do we go with Synapse Analytics? I said, well, do we take the red pill or the blue pill? I feel like Morpheus off the Matrix, giving Neo a choice, but it depends again. I hate to say it, the consultant swear jar of it depends, but I think what it depends on is we need to look at the, you know, all of the maturity that we get in Databricks and maybe some of the performance elements as well. Maybe some of the virtual network integrations. You know, do we want to control our clusters, and you know, what other capabilities of Databricks do we get in there? You know, sure, both have Apache Spark. Databricks obviously bring a lot to the party in terms of other stuff as well, and what they do. It's a great question. It's a hard one to answer. It depends, and again, hopefully, I'm kind of informing what it depends on for you. But I'd say, let's take it offline. Let's look at your use case. Let's really drill into that. And yeah, if we need to do something exotic with data engineering, we can take this path, and otherwise we can take another path. But yeah, great question. Hopefully that's the best informed answer I could give you for now.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone, to your great questions. I can see others coming through. So I think in my best recommendations, Paul, if you can just move it on to the next steps slide for me, that would be really, really helpful. Thanks. There's loads of great questions coming through, and we appreciate, especially with the new roadmap, dependent on your use case, even the pathways in Fabric, that Paul's mentioned there, whether or not it's real-time analytics, or really just exchanging that hybrid approach. We do have a Microsoft Fabric briefing workshop here at Coeo, and actually you'll be able to talk to Paul as well, as we work in conjunction together on this experience. So it's almost access to both organisations there as well. Just really around your approach to Fabric, whether or not that's guidance and support, how to actually start a POC, or which areas of Fabric you should be looking at for a POC, especially if you want to look at that hybrid approach or looking at new capability that maybe you don't currently have with your analytics platform today. Those questions that you've got there, that Microsoft Fabric briefing is a perfect forum for that, where we can go into it in a little bit more detail, bespoke to your organisation. So there is a QR code, there's a forms there if that would be of interest. So please just do that and get in contact with Coeo, and I'll make sure that's facilitated for you. The second part that I did allude to earlier, that is just to find out if you are eligible for Microsoft funding. So from a Microsoft perspective, they're keen, obviously, to get people on the platform, testing and exploring the platform and seeing what it means to them. So there is Azure Innovate funding that is specific to data and AI workloads, and Microsoft Fabric is included in that. So what I would say is reach out to Coeo to find out whether or not you're eligible for that funding, and it could literally be to explore one of those pathways that Paul referenced, even if that's data science, for example, within Fabric, to really kind of get that off the ground and test and explore and see if that's worth your organisation investing into. So those are just a couple of next steps, aside from all the great resources, the great links that Paul has shared today, particularly around the roadmap, the training and organisations as well. And we do also run training events here at Coeo called Fabric Analyst in a Day. So if, say, for example, you're working towards accreditations, or actually you want to send any of your team on training specifically for Fabric, please check out our events calendar on the Coeo website, where all of those latest dates are shared. So I just want to say thank you ever so much to Paul for the time that you've spent with myself here at Coeo and with the attendees today. I hope that's been incredibly useful for you, even to kind of ascertain which direction you should take your POC in, or actually to say we don't have to transition to Fabric straight away. It can be part of a larger plan and start to look at that POC as you go forwards. The recording will be shared with all attendees along with the slides. So that will be coming over to you over the coming days. So thank you very much for attending, and we hope to speak to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.